Well, good morning and welcome to another Patreon Tank Chats. Get my words out. Start again. Well, good morning and welcome to another Patreon question and answer session. And as you can see, I'm outside. It's a bit of a nippy morning. It's a bit of a frost first thing. Walked the dog, and now I'm sitting in the back garden. And you can see, I don't know if some of you are watching about this time last year, the primroses, a drifter primrose starting to come out again. So I'm hoping the sun's coming out in a moment and it's going to warm up a bit. But it's, what are we, something early April now, 2021. And like everybody, we're all confused about times, dates and everything. But well done, all you patrons who are still supporting us. Thank you very much for doing that. And I'll get straight on with some of the questions. Even though actually I'm going to fudge a couple of these questions as I normally do. First question is actually from Federico. Sorry, and I've got Finn here as well. Finn, come here, come on. Sorry, I ignored you tonight. I didn't introduce him. Finn the dog, is, some of you will be aware, has to join in for a fair bit. What's going on? Keeps him happy, and I have to throw the ball to shut him up every now and again. So anyway, Federico de Liberto says he was looking for some information about the French auto loaders, particularly the ones on the Lorraine 40T and the AMX50. And he's saying, I don't think they've got the same auto loader systems as the AMX13, but I can't find almost any information online. I have a similar problem, I'm afraid to say. Our archive at the moment, we're having some work done, we're having it insulated and various other things going on. Most of the stacks are actually covered in plastic. And Federico, I would say, even if I could look, it could be that there was reports, because we've obviously mainly got British records, but it may well be the British were evaluating at some point auto loaders, and these are mentioned or looked at. The other place that's always, I think, quite worth looking at, especially when you're looking at fairly obscure bits of technology, are the areas to do with things such as the defence journals like Jane's, because every now and again they'll have an in-depth article on a new product or something, and sometimes, sadly, that might be the only place you'll find information, because some of the projects don't go much further forward. Some of them are just wrapped up in the official reports files. Do they make it to an archive somewhere? And the other obvious one is, best of luck, but do try SAMUR, the French tank museum archive, because obviously it's really their topic rather than ours to a certain degree. But so sorry, I can't really give you anything on that one. Connor Sweeney asked the question, I was wondering about how often tank transporters were used in World War II, and how common was it for a tank to be moved by a transporter rather than travelling under its own power or by rail? And what were the conditions that led to transporters being used or not? Well, I think, Connor, on that one, it's another question that I could drop my shoulders and sort of say, nowadays you ought to go to Royal Logistics Corps. I think it was Remy in the past had tank transporters. In Britain, I've mentioned before, the museum network, we tend to cut up the subject in military museums, and even though they're connected, obviously tank transporters, we don't have a tank transporter at the museum, because that part of the remit, where we concentrate our resources on the actual AFVs, that part is being looked after by other parts of the core museum network. So they'd be the place to really ask that. But just obviously a fairly off the top of the head type answer. The issue about using tank transporters is there's never enough of them. So tanks, if you actually look at the stats in terms, I think it was about 1,000 Diamond Ts were used by the British in World War II, the standard tank transporter. We had Scammels, we had others as well, but it was the Diamond Ts that made up the most. When you look, there's just not enough of them to do the transporting. And of course you would want a tank to be transported on a tank transporter whenever possible to lessen the track mileage. If it's anywhere near combat, lessen the fatigue on the crew, make sure the vehicle's getting near the front line in as good a condition as you can have it. It's not worn down, it's not having the chance of more breakdowns, you're not having losses en route, etc. So rail, yes, certainly around the UK, rail from the factories to distribution points, etc. If you look, most of them seem to be driven onto landing craft or LSTs, etc. When they're going from the British ports to France, but you'll also see vehicles being craned off onto railway flats in some of the French ports, especially if they're coming straight from America at certain times. So this assumption of trying to use some form of other transport rather than the tank's own tracks and engines, which we all know wear out relatively quickly and cause failures, etc., would have been there. At the same time, the opportunity to use tank transporters is not always there. So look at those pictures, North Africa, where you've got them ferrying back and forward, because actually, I know it sounds, with these whopping great engines on tank transporters, but they're still much more fuel efficient than a tank driving. So you're saving on other resources as well as crew fatigue, as I've mentioned earlier on. And there's another point as well, which sometimes we forget about, which is transporters don't damage roads as much, and there'll be times and places where that would have made a real difference, because again, if you end up being the tanks that chew up the road, the other soft skin vehicles and probably other track vehicles later on are going to suffer as well. So that idea of there's a desire there to use them when possible, the assets are not always available to do it when everybody would like them to be able to use that way. So who gets control of the assets? When do you actually sort of get the rights to use those things? And I've just been doing some filming about the Rhineland battles. And again, those tank transporters are not just being used to ferry forward things like the actual tanks, they're also being used to ferry forward pontoons, ducks, bridging equipment, other types of things at the same time. They're not singly dedicated just to the armour. And the other side of it as well is coming back. There was times, especially in the Desert War, where there was very little in the way of proper armoured fighting vehicle recovery in terms of armoured vehicles like Sherman and ARVs, etc., to be able to recover vehicles. So quite often those tank transporters were being used almost as recovery, emergency recovery for breakdown vehicles in the field. So again, all the time, the number of assets that are going to be available just to manoeuvre tanks around the battlefield or around, behind the lines, etc., is going to be less and less. So a bit woolly, but you can see that there's criteria there. It may not be able to be met by the available resources all the time. And again, European rail network, when the rails are up, on the Eastern Front, the Germans are trying to keep the railways going all the time, because again, if they can actually transport troops, vehicles, equipment, supplies by rail, much better for them than you can imagine the unmetalled roads in much of Russia, and the length of those lines of supply journeys are just so ridiculously long. It's only going to be railways that'll make it achievable. Michael Schwern, hello David and Finn. Finn's here, good. Second time of asking, why did the Panther models start at Alstrom D, then A, then G? In Chank number 16, they work down the letters in German system and Panther 3 work up. What changed? The Panther one, sorry if I haven't answered it before, if you've asked it before. The Panther one, I have never found a straight answer to why the first production models are coming out as Ds. But if you go to Tom Jentz, one of the points he's trying to make early on in this, when he's talking about naming of German vehicles and the way the VK system, the way they get different number names very specifically at certain times, very confusing if you're looking at it from the outside. Is it this one we're talking about? Whether the Germans themselves ever use, because they never use the Ausführung lettering on the hull for when they're ordering parts, etc. So I'll just mention what he says here. The Ausführung letter designation was not used when issuing Panthers to unit, nor was the Ausführung used in making decisions relating to tactical employment. So just because you've got Gs and they've got As or something makes no difference to the troops. The assembly firms also use the Ausführung designation. I'll just for a previous sentence. The original use of the Ausführung designation was for specific identification by the designers. The assembly firms also use the Ausführung designation stipulated in their contracts for delivery of a specified number of each Ausführung. As used by the troops, the Alstrom designation was utilised to identify compatible repair parts and identification of differences to aid in maintenance. The original records do not contain a single reference to an Alstrom B, C or E, so we know there was no, this idea that there was sequential, that if there was never a B, C or E, why not type of thing, because there's no mention of it at all. Nor is it a logical assumption that these three letters were ever used. The Alstrom letter was a modifier applied to the designation BZK Panther. What I believe is he's trying, and he goes on about the group of numbers, about how different drawings are used, and then those are stamped on vehicles, and that helps you identify how the vehicle has been put together and into what category of Alstrom it would therefore fit. But what I think he's really trying to say is that actually, as a Alstrom, it's a specific set of drawings for a model. Not necessarily we always start with this model A, model B, and if the model, as we think, the model G, or D rather, is kind of been worked up and is ready ahead of what we might have logically said was an A or another model, then that is the one that's chosen and why it's going into production that way, not that they've done all the work, they've done all these different sorts of stuff, and then they say, right, this is the first one we're going to put into production, and then we name it Alstrom A because it's the first one, and then Alstrom B. That, I believe, is the logic there. I'd be fascinated if anyone's found any other evidence to put that on there, because I've asked the question myself. You know, I've got no what I would call straight answer that anyone actually points at and says that is why the D comes out first, rather than this what we would logically think and what seems to happen most of the times, which is a sequential in a chronological order. So the first one's an A, that gets developed first, then it moves on to the next model, which will be a B, rather than the fact that there's actually a number of models being developed at the same time, and it just so happens the D is the first one that's put into series production. So I don't know if that really answers it, but hope that goes somewhere towards it. Sorry, ball for Finn. Slurp of the coffee in my I Like Tanks mugs. No products for sale here, but don't forget to keep looking onto the shop. Sorry if there's slurping sound effects on the microphone. What do you care, dog? Trevor Long says, Antonio Bernardo asked the questions. Greetings, David. Excellent Q&A, thank you. I want to pose a question regarding AFV production. Disregarding nuclear attack, could modern AFV production be sustainable in a World War II type of industrial warfare? Would nations have to downgrade their technology to keep churning out vehicles? Ooh, isn't that an interesting question? Because as we've all discovered in COVID, the idea that what you can do within your national boundaries is very limited these days because of the way of international trade, etc. Are we going to? So the example being, so you think of America in World War II, building the tank factories, that idea of the complete production, almost like, you know, raw metal coming in one end and tanks coming out the other. The idea of being able to do that within a single nation country in the future, where we know we're either going to modern vehicles, electronics, we need copper from there, we need some rare metals to do with transistors or something else this way. Would it be possible to carry on making the standard of vehicles that are being in the factories now if suddenly all the shutters came down, as it were, around the world? A big issue that, as I said, COVID has raised that sense of, again, how internationally we rely on each other. If you want to put it in a positive way, in a negative way, we are vulnerable because of the international trade that goes on, and if the shutters come down or things are not allowed to be exchanged or traded, you have a major problems there, of course. So my thoughts on that would be, for the longer term, yes, if we're talking warfare 5 to 10 years, I could genuinely imagine with things like scientific effort, and if you're talking about major wars of national survival, then just like COVID, that idea of national effort, it's not easy, but people do come together and come up with solutions and new vaccine ideas that way, etc., to be able to try and cope with the situation. In the short term, my gut feeling is there will be a bit like the Falklands War, a little flurry going on behind the scenes where, for example, the example there was Argentina was desperately trying to get hold of Exocet missiles to be able to fire at the British ships off the Falklands, and there was a black market going on, and British Special Forces, MI6, various other people were turning up literally in car parks, stopping deals going ahead by various means, and so that equipment didn't get to the end user that could have been used against British ships. So you can imagine how that will happen. There will be a scurry for certain types of components, whether it's ready-made stuff, and it's one of, again, the modern, talking from Britain, classic dilemmas. You go and give the equivalent, come a war, the gold credit card, when you've actually got a conflict. Here's the gold credit card, go and buy what you need, chaps, because the cupboard's kept pretty empty in peacetime. What if everyone else has beaten you in the queue? What if they've got bigger buying bucks? What if they've already done deals? What if that market has dried up again? So, as I was saying, I think in the short term there will be real issues for most countries to continue production unless you're a superpower, maybe America, maybe China, but even they're importing bits of their technologies and some of the raw materials, and obviously that's why China's using its influence around the world, you know, in what seems to be a sort of, you know, sort of funding road, etc., because it's really after raw materials to keep its industrial complexes going. So that idea that if that gets interrupted, inevitably what you can produce in your factory is going to change. But how quickly they'd adapt or start saying, actually, we now need a simpler vehicle because we're going to have to get rid of that piece of technology. So again, it's an interesting question because how the armies will fight in the future. At the moment, we see this plethora of technology. No one can keep up with the implications of whether it's clever drone use and all these different things. Will they, and there's an example, will they all of a sudden not just be looking at the military, as some countries have, they'll just go to commercial markets and suddenly every drone for sale in whatever, you know, technology shop around the country will disappear because it's suddenly being subsumed into the military for some sort of military use. And however crude that might be, it might still have an effect and might still work. So, yeah, interesting thought for the future, and especially in an age where this new generation of technology seems to be seducing so many militaries. Great for a short-term minor conflict, longer-term conflicts where you've got blocking or peer enemies that might be able to defeat some of those technologies. How is that going to impact as well? Trevor Long, sorry. I take it it's still a bit cool in the UK. You can say this morning, frost on the ground when I was walking. Not in Sydney, we're getting out the t-shirts and shorts. Yeah, thanks for rubbing that in. Can I assume that your back garden is small, given the rapidity that Finn brings back the ball so quickly? You can. It's not a huge garden, but it's an awful lot bigger than, I don't want to sound like I'm boasting here, than a lot of people's gardens in Britain. And boy, am I grateful to have a garden after the last year's COVID, so or this year's COVID as well. To be able to run the dog. So, and I don't throw the ball too far and too fast or whatever, because again, there's a hedge and there's a path the other side and everything. So if I start losing it that way, all the glass windows for the house and things. So, yeah, he comes back quite quick. It's not a huge one, but it keeps him happy and he feels quite good about it. Hank Schultz. I'll come back to. He's just mentioned about that idea about the Sherman, how we still have, you know, depending on the books we've read, mixed views. When the pendulum goes one way, perhaps, as I say, I go too far. Actually, I think the Sherman was a brilliant bit of design for what it did. If you're the poor soldier in the Sherman and you're unlucky enough, rare though the occasion would be, to meet one of those German tanks that's superior to you, of course you might well be feeling that Sherman wasn't good enough. The phrase that was often used about the Sherman, good enough, because they could make so many of them, etc. But do be careful of that sort of blind, you know, they were all rubbish or they were Tommy cookers and everything else. The arguments, as so often in our subject areas, there's more nuancing, more layers. And for me, I find that much more interesting, and to take these things apart, I'm answering questions here in a way that actually somebody, probably people watching, who are more nuanced in some of the arguments, yes, you can forgive me certain things, but there's probably times you're screaming, hang on a second, because it's only when you know those other background issues and other things that are going on, which is why, for example, in the tank chats, I like bringing in, the economics, the politics, everything else, about why that vehicle comes out, because the end result, yes, certainly on a battlefield, it might be fighting this type of machine, but do we understand why that country, why that military, why the politics, what everything else has made that vehicle in that manner at that particular time? Because sometimes they can be an amazing achievement against all the odds, etc. But somehow, just because this one's got a millimetre thicker armour, we think this one's rubbish and that one's better. So it's the subtleties. What was the nature of they thought warfare was going to be? Who bet on the right arguments? Because this idea that somehow, just because you were lucky, if that's the phrase to use, that your theory proved right at a certain time, whereas other people's ones, proved wrong. Does that mean that they were absolutely all? Is it random sometimes? Is it just luck, the way certain things develop or certain things happen? So anyway, back to the Sherman. The debate will continue, no doubt. Sorry, and I've got Mark Ryan here. He says, as a Dorset paramedic with a passion for all things World War II, especially tanks, can you, David, discuss what trauma care was available on Allied and Axis armoured vehicles and how they differed, such as morphine, tourniquets, etc.? P.S. So glad the museum and its all employees survived the pandemic. Well, we're not there yet, but we hope we will be. May 17th, fingers crossed at the moment. Keep an eye on the website. May 17th should be the opening date. I'm awaiting my latest purchase from the shop, Sensible Fellow, and I'll be there on your first day of opening. Do say hello. We do look forward, boy, do we look forward to seeing people back in the museum again. Now, we do have books, a couple of boxes on AFV, crewman, first aid, training, that sort of thing. We've also got the reports that were done by 21st Army Group, which actually analyses who got wounded how many got burns, how many were killed outright, how many lost limbs, etc. All charming stuff in tanks. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, I can't get access to those boxes at the moment, but I was going to. I've got one, I think, in the garage there, actually, one of those little World War IIs. Sometimes you see them at boot fairs. Little black Japan boxes, AFV crewmen, they'll say on it, and they were quite often sold on after the war, and you find people in the back of their cars. That was the equivalent. Boots used to do them, the chemists in Britain, little black tin, Japan tin boxes, little pin out the front. You open it up and there'd be a selection of gauzes, tourniquets, various first aid things that you were thought to. Just like modern cars, you carry a first aid kit, or you should if you've got any sense. Now, those World War II ones, again, just from some of the accounts I was looking at, they are given basic first aid, but many of the soldiers, when you read these accounts, the minute they've had a tank knocked out in action, they're waiting for the MO, medical orderly, or the doc to come up in his half track to help sort out the wounded. So the idea of being able to do, whether it's a corpsman, whether it's someone trained in first aid, the idea that you apply immediate first aid, i.e. stop the bleeding, tourniquets, triage in certain basic senses, I would like to think many of the soldiers know, but I have to say as well, when you read some of the accounts, it's pretty obvious they're not really that au fait with what they should be doing. And again, that, like the whole army, like I say every time, it really varies unit to unit, trooper to trooper, what course you attended when, did they have the time for that properly, etc. Again, it touches other issues like burns, how we got much better with burns victims. We've got some displays in the museums where from the First World War and onwards, how did they cope with that issue where somebody had been badly burned, and you read, again, graphic accounts of people not recognising each other, even their own crew members, because of the nature of their burns when they try and take them out of the vehicles. That idea, and they do have, and again, I'm not really answering because I haven't got the material, but the one anecdote that I always love telling, we have a first aid kit that the chap brought back from the Western Desert, and it's on display or parts of it are on display in the museum. We couldn't display the rest of it because they have these little ampules of morphine. And of course, now it's a prohibited substance, your controlled substance as a drug in the UK. You just can't leave these things lying around, as it were. So we ended up taking some to the medical centre to see if we could get the morphine taken out. But what had happened was this chap, whose material, again, when you're back at the museum, we put a lot of it in the desert section. He put labels on everything. And when we opened his first aid kit, there was some of the bandages still, etc. And he put a little label on the outside, use this kit when I was in the desert, Alamein. And when we got to the little tin that's supposed to have these 4 ampules in, there's 3 ampules, and he'd put another little sticker on the end. And it said, "I gave this to a wounded German soldier at Alamein. I hope he made it." Brilliant. You know, when you get little items like that have got such a story behind them, I find that amazing sort of ones. But you know, those I think I mentioned another Q&A. You know, there's the other side of it. We're looking at some guy's battle dress, and it got a bulge in one of the pockets. And, you know, normally these things are dry clean, done whatever over the years and everything. Anyway, we went in the pocket, and out came a field dressing. And it was caked, absolutely. This wasn't someone, you know, little nick on your finger type thing. This had been a major, caked in blood, all wrapped up and all screwed together and dried out over the decades in this guy's pocket. And so sometimes you know, you almost see the evidence of these things going on that way. But as you can imagine now, with all sorts of issues going on in museums, but that all to do with medical records is the other one. That idea behind of what actually happens to the individual. You know, there's 2 sides. There's one side of me that's kind of saying, for goodness sake, give these people, it's when, you know, showing dead bodies and everything else, give them some sort of decency and respect. And yet at the same time, by showing that, I think it's quite important that we also see the consequences of what happens to people in a tank in warfare. And it's the same as, you know, most people, you have to watch your health and safety film, don't you? And we do some for our volunteers and the guys in the workshop. And I always remember everyone's always sort of like, you know, we sit there politely, there's a few sort of, you know, few jokes and everything else that way. Everybody sobers up and suddenly is shifting in their seats when they start showing you those images of where people haven't followed the guidance or the advice. And this is what happened when you end up using this power tool in the wrong way, or what can do. And just looking at some of those photos, again, sorry for the person, but I do sometimes think it's worth seeing those images, because it starts sobering you up to the reality of what goes on and making yourself feel a little bit less cocky and a little bit more conscious of yourself and the people you're working with, of course, as well, when you're doing all that. Right, moving on. Are there any Chieftain tanks still in service this day? Are all of them obsolete? Not absolute. That's Rees 4-acre. We think there may well be some Chieftains still put back into service. Iran, Iraq, numbers were captured. There is some evidence that they've kind of upgraded some in the Middle East, or got a number of them going again for various reasons. UK, no. They've all gone out of service. I believe Jordan and some of the other countries that had variants type of thing haven't technically got them in service anymore, even though they might still be sitting in a shed somewhere. In the UK, there's probably, well, there's a number obviously running in private hands, Tank Museum, etc. But there's also a couple on a couple of the firing ranges. Kinetic still use a Chieftain hull, I believe, to drive around some guns for experimental firing, etc. But yeah, you know, because when you think about it, if you've got a 120mm gun and a platform to put it on, it's still quite an impressive little bit of kit. So you can see why if you do have access to them, you might still think that's a worthwhile thing, especially as we always talk about, you're not fighting top level all the time, peer against peer. It may well be you're fighting against another type of enemy where even a very dated tank can have an effect, but certainly none in the British Army anymore. Michael Walton's asking the questions there. Quite a bit of variety on how tankers stored their personal effects and gear on their tanks. Sorry, another slurp before it goes cold. Whilst British and US tanks seem festooned by the crew's personal gear all over the vehicles, some German vehicles, primarily pictures Late War Panthers, appear to have no or minimal personal gear stored on the exterior of the vehicles. Were the German tank crews stored? Where did the German tank crews store all of their personal gear? Did they store it externally, or did they keep their personal gear in the rear or on their follow-up vehicles, lager sites, etc.? Actually, we know the Tiger, that bin on the back, again, some of the German stowage diagrams as well, but they know that's where you kept your greatcoat, your blanket, etc. on that big bin on the rear of the turret. There's bins on the rear of the Panther. Some of the times they lost those, but those on that angled rear engine compartment, there's two big bins there where they could stow some of their own kit. Some of the kit gets stowed inside. Like everybody, I think it's down to your unit commander how you discipline the crews, because again, stowage, as we've talked about this before, stowage, the 8th Army got famous for looking like gypsies. That was all well and good until you found stowage caused you problems fighting. So fires, because again, things touching hot exhaust, if you're not clever about that, the fact you can then cause a fire, which if that incapacitates your vehicle, is your commander is not going to be happy about that. There's enough things to go wrong without you causing more problems. And the other possibility as well that was absolutely taken and looked at Villers-Bocage was the idea of you have too much kit to make your life feel better. If that gets in the way of action, i.e. traversing the turret, jamming things up, the chance of things getting caught, the paratraverse is not that powerful, so the idea of suddenly you're snagging because of baggage or things hanging off the turret, snagging on other bits of the vehicle or other things, that was again looked at, and there tends to be sort of like an incident that then causes right, that's it, get rid of all that stuff outside, you're allowed the following and that's your lot. So I think it's you only have to see it in a practical sense when you go camping. Sometimes you want to take everything with you, in next to no time you realise this stuff's getting in the way of you doing things efficiently. So how do you want to minimise it? Life's little luxury is being able to have that cooker, being able to have a blanket, a coat, whatever else, it sort of things. If you can find places to squeeze that in there. The British vehicles, as you mentioned, very clearly on the stowage diagrams where you're supposed to put the set bits of kit like your blanket, greatcoat, water bottles, etc. Less so on the German vehicles, but I would suggest you have a look at those where some of those things with the bins, whether they feel they just don't have as much in terms of largesse, amount of stuff to carry around as British and Americans. You may postulate that. I don't really know that as a definite answer, but I think everybody tries to keep their stuff to a minimum. Your support echelons, that's where you keep a kit bag with all the other, your second uniform and all your other bits of kit. You are not expected to have that with you all the time. It's how often you can marry up with the rear echelon vehicles to change your clothes, do other things. And sometimes that's fine because you're all in the same area together, training, etc. Times of combat or advances, that may be where things get stretched a bit. Hugh McDermott, he explained about the Austin Allegro steering wheel on TOG. Thank you for that, but it's not there, but there we go. Michael Gallash, hello David, thanks for answering the fuel questions. Do you have any plans to reprint the German versions of the Tiger or Panther feed wheel? Nice for your German friends. We're looking at it. Those of you will be aware we've done a crowd-funded, going very well for us. We're going to be reprinting in English the Panther Feeble. We're looking at what it would be to do a German edition of that as well. How simple, how complex. Because again, part of the problem, of course, is you have to set up the typeface and all the different things and get another one printed. And suddenly, if the profit margin becomes so ridiculously low, is it worth doing it? But there probably is enough German people there. And again, we'd probably have a look at our own because we've got a copy. Other people have done the Tiger Feeble before. But again, what might we be able to do? Could we add something a bit more to it? I've done a little intro into the beginning of the Panther Feeble, you know, and talking about a number of the issues behind this, and also just another side of things in that, particularly about German design, not so much just the tank, but how they produce their manuals, what it looked like. So there's a whole issue about the Nazis and typeface, you name it. There's other stories that go with these things as well. So we're looking at that, watch this space. As with everything, keep an eye on our website. That's where we'll be doing the appeals, or is there the interest there? Because that's a great bit with us, with our online audience. We can now ask you as an audience, is this something, if we did it, that's going to sell, or will you fund it now? And then we know with confidence, because I come back to all the time, and I repeat this as you being patrons, for us as an independent charity, the idea we can't splash the cash in taking too many risks with our money, especially with COVID and the fact the museum's been closed and money's tight for everything. So we need to have assurances up in advance that if we're going to invest some money into getting something reprinted or done, there is the market there for it. And now with the internet and you guys out there, it means that we can do that very easily, or relatively easily, with crowdfunding an item, so that, you know, you've basically paid for it in advance, and that covers our costs so that we can then go ahead with things that way. So again, keep watching this space on those ones. Peter Wignall asked the question, I notice in some of the tank chats references made to tanks that the museums intends to loan to another, or conversely that the museum has on loan vehicle from another collection. How does the museum decide if and what to loan to others, and how does it decide what to borrow, whether to borrow, if that's the right word? Many thanks, and thanks for the online content, Peter. Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I imagine there's a few people out there thinking, oh, I wonder if I could borrow a tank from the Tank Museum. You know, that would look good in the garden for a week or two. How we do it, we obviously, we welcome requests from accredited museums or international museums of standing. In other words, it's got to be a pucker place. We understand who they are. They're doing it to the same standards, controls, etc. as we would be at the Tank Museum, and in Britain that's called an accredited museum. What we then do is we look at what is being requested. Drop, Finn. Because there's some that are much easier to answer and oblige than others. Because if somebody says to us, Little Willie, could we borrow that for this exhibition in wherever it happens to be? Our question would be, well, hang on a second, that for us is a key exhibit. It's at the Tank Museum where it, you know, the story begins and we tell the story fully. We would probably argue that, however lovely the place that's trying to borrow it is, that is such a key exhibit for us in a place where people would expect to find it and come to see it after all this time. Very unlikely we're going to lend that, let alone the practicalities of having to take half the galleries apart to try and get it out. So all those things would probably very quickly add up to, you can see very quickly that's a no-no. There's other things, because of where they are, multiples we hold, they're in store, we're running out of room again, you know, it's quite nice lending stuff away, it gives you a bit of breathing space. New things arriving, a better one's coming, we know this is happening, etc. So that will give us confidence in other areas to then say, yes, actually we can quite happily do this. And we have a standard loan agreements, or we negotiate those loan agreements. It's normally things such as, to think of things like in the art world, it's what they call nail to nail. The minute something comes off the wall or comes out the gallery, the borrowing party has to insure it. So if it falls off the back of a low loader or something gets nicked, whatever, that it's covered as an item. That's part of our responsibility of looking after our collection. If we are lending it away, we've got to make sure where it goes to or have the right standards in place, security, etc., all that sort of stuff. And that's a well-established conventions between proper museums over time. The biggest one, I would argue, that is just a showstopper is that the threshold for a loan in terms of finances is quite considerable. We're not charging for that loan, but you're going to need quite a bit of money to get a transporter. And again, we would have to approve or recommend a transporter. We're not having someone turning up hoping he's going to be able to strap it to the back of his whatever he's turned up with. You know, it's got to be done in a professional manner. So that idea, but as soon as you're talking, and those of you, if you know about haulage, etc., straight away you're in the thousands to move a tank anywhere, even within national boundaries, let alone the other element of paperwork, getting it through customs abroad and other things that way. Not impossible, again, we are lending to our European friends, and we've got stuff in Vienna, we've got stuff in Holland at the moment. So there's times where things could be available that seem pertinent to that country as well. What are the things that, when's an anniversary coming up? Actually, this vehicle is, or it's going to be in our store, we think now, for at least 5 or 10 years before there's any likelihood of it being looked at for whatever's coming up around the corner. So there's good times and bad times. There's also going to be, just like Little Willie, there's going to be items that, everybody would love. Our Tiger 131. We know we really rely on Tiger 131 as a draw, as an income generator, etc. So very unlikely that we're going to be able to lend Tiger 131, however much we'd love to see it, go out there and do other things. And I come back to money, because otherwise we'd be losing a potential source of income, and I don't think anybody out there is going to be able to sort of suddenly say, well, yes, we'd like to borrow it and we're going to pay you for those losses that you would have made at the time, because again, most military museums don't have that sort of money kicking around. So back to economics of part of it as well is what I would say is another fundamental one there. But and we also have a collection committee, so even though museums are regularly lending material to each other, as part and parcel of their daily work, we also have a collection committee that's almost like a bit of a backstop. So if there is a bit of a debate, or we want about a bit of top cover, we think this is too risky, or we don't like an idea of it, or frankly, terribly sorry, no, we're going to be using it ourselves. That can always help if it's got the backing, as it were, of a collection committee. But 9 out of 10 loans, to be honest, tend to be the things that are done as a common sense thing that museums do with each other all the time. Just with tanks, the problem is the economics of the scale of the blooming things, and just manoeuvring them at both ends, getting them into your museum if it's a dead vehicle, great if it runs, but even then, you've got to send a trained driver over to manoeuvre it. So all of that is an awful lot more. My usual analogy is like with teapots or something. If you're doing it with a teapot, yes, you've got to be delicate. Yes, you've got everything has to go through, but the physicality of some of the problems facing it are less than with a 40, 60 ton tank, you see, along those lines. That's the last of the questions. So I've, as ever, whittled on. Finn's had a whale of a time. He says hello, and even though he's running off all over the place. Thank you. Please do continue your support. Sorry I wasn't able to answer everything this time round, but work's going on. Keep an eye on that website. Well done, those of you, I know you've been telling me about it, buying stuff from the shop. New stuff coming in all the time. We're commissioning new material. Our online shop has done us fantastically well, and so have you lot. As just being a patron, that's helping us support, keeping us going through as everybody's going through these difficult times. Fingers crossed later this year, we're hoping it's going to start, easing in the right way. Keep an eye on those dates of how we've had to move events and do certain things, and we'll keep you informed on the website about any changes, anything going. But, as you're saying here, do come and visit when you've got the chance. If you can't visit, do keep supporting us that way as well. So thank you, and goodbye from me, and goodbye from Finn. You all right, Finn? Okay, we'll say goodbye.